Somehow, even though it feels like I just battled for Ursula yesterday, we're mere weeks away from another round of set championships. And there's also two more North American Challenge events ahead of us, with Las Vegas later this month and Seattle in October. So that leads to the big question that eternally looms over all Illumineers: what deck should I play? So, with me today are some very talented Lorcana players who have been faced with this very conundrum. First up, I have a player who has competed in both challenges and championships alike and spends her free time creating informative content with her husband to help educate fellow players on everything Disney Lorcana. She is a lovely and talented Ellie of Sprinkle of Ink. Hello.
Hey, thanks for having me at the end. I'm glad to rest for a little bit and talk about all things choosing a deck.
Yeah, I mean, the secret sauce is you were supposed to be on the podcast and you fell ill. So I'm glad you recovered and, you got
Yes,
over it's not a con funk, a challenge funk. I don't know.
I I think looking back that I probably had COVID during the whole thing, and it's going to come up probably when we talk about performance, that
Oh,
the
well,
brain fog was so bad that I just made some silly decisions that I
I don't
don't
have that
suggest you make.
excuse. Yeah, I don't have that excuse, but I'll say that. I'll be like, I probably did too, actually.
Yeah.
But thank you for joining. And next, I have a man who's both a Lorcana and fashion icon alike. You might know him from his work on the show This Week in Ink or as a caster for several of the challenge events. But more importantly, he is the man that started the bucket hat movement. He is a Stitch enthusiast and overall Lorcana legend. It's Brandon.
What's up? Hello. Thank you for having me. Awesome introduction, by the way. I love that the legacy that I'm leaving is bucket hats.
Hey,
That's
you can't stop it now. The
I
train has already
can't.
left the station.
I
Yeah.
can't. There's no stopping the trend, so might as well embrace it.
I mean, I
Yeah,
wore my motto. Where's your bucket hat?
I can't, I need to get headphones that just like go in the ears because people ask me this for the challenges too when we cast. They're like, why don't you wear a bucket hat on stream? Will they let you? I'm like, they'll let me if it's Disney like official, but I have this ginormous headset on my head. And I mean, bucket hats already look a little bit silly when you wear them
yeah,
normally. They look extra silly when they're like a couple inches off of your head where they're supposed to be. So
it's true. And as I have a message, I think I tweeted about it that once you commit to wearing the bucket hat, you cannot uncommit to wearing the bucket hat, for it does leave a bucket shaped impression on your head.
yeah.
So it is a commitment that I don't think you get to casually switch between. Well, thank you both for joining. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to make this episode is because before I think like every set championship, every DLC, there just starts being tweets of like, still don't know what I'm going to play, trying to figure out what I want to play. And so I kind of wanted to have the conversation of, what are some different ways that people approach this and hopefully give some insight into your own process and, get people a place to start. I mean, spoiler alert, we're not going to tell you the deck that's going to win you the DLC or set championship, but I think you'll have a better idea of where to start and where to head after it. So I'll start with you, Brendan. When it comes to picking what deck that you're going to bring to set championships, because I know you played in a couple of them, how you decide what to bring to to some kind of tournament that you actually want to win at.
So, personally, when I'm going to these set champs or DLCs, I haven't played in a DLC yet, but if I get the opportunity to, I'm going to win. And so, like, that's sort of my mindset going in. I want to build a deck that is going to perform well as a competitor, which, contrary to popular belief, like, is not everybody's goal. I kind of want to make that clear. Like, sometimes people go to a set champs and are just playing for fun. And so, like, the advice that I give everybody that I think trumps anything is like, play what you're comfortable with, play what you want to play. It doesn't matter if Steel Song or Ruby Amethyst is the best deck in the format. Like, if you're playing Mufasa and you like it, go play Mufasa. But for me personally, what I like to do is I'll go use a couple different resources, specifically something like ink decks, and find what decks are currently performing the best in the metagame, and especially in the place that I live, which is a very rural area, and there's not like 60 player set champs going on. I kind of never know what I'm going to walk into in a room. So I've learned the lesson the hard way that the global meta that everybody's talking about in the Lorcana world does not always reflect your local meta. And so I also usually try to look for a deck that's pretty consistent, and I'll try to play it a couple weeks in advance, as practice before actually going into the set champs.
Yeah, I mean, I love that you mentioned that local, because I think one thing is, I mean, even like we talk about like national, European versus North American even seems like it can be different. So I think sometimes we talk about meta as like this overarching, impossible, like, or rather an immovable data point. But I think it really is something that context is super important when you talk about that word, which we'll get more into later. Now, Ellie, I actually met you at the challenge in Fort Worth. So, what deck did you bring to that event? Because that, for listeners that haven't played in either, set championships are generally going to be anywhere from like 3 to 5 rounds before we go to top cuts. I think 6 if you're getting kind of crazy. While a challenge event is going to be 9 rounds before just in day one. Which some of you might make it to day 2, and then you got more rounds. But at the base, it's 9 rounds. So, how did you make that determination of what deck you wanted to play for those 9 rounds?
So last set, I decided I wanted to take competitive seriously because I kind of was that person that Brandon was talking about who just showed up for fun and had my fun deck and was like, if I get top 8, it's great. If I get top 4, it's great. But I was like, I'm tired of losing. I'm going to take this seriously. So I actually did a training session with a competitive player. And we determined that my play style, I'm an aggro player, and that's not the best meta deck right now to play. It hasn't really fleshed out in the meta yet. So we built what we could get as close to in Ruby Amethyst for that. And so I was playing a Ruby Amethyst package. And then with the ladies from Left to Lord, we fine-tuned it, and I ended up on the Jem Hawkins location package and kind of took that curveball approach, and it worked really well for me. And I played it at set championships. I put a ton of hours in on it in our stream, playing against my husband, playing against every single meta deck I could get my hands on. And then the brain fog came in, and on the way to Fort Worth, I decided I wanted to change my deck.
I like that.
Uh,
You threw some chaos in there.
I don't suggest it. So I took both. I basically took the best of both decks and shoved it together and made just a mediocre Ruby Amethyst deck. So I had a really good deck against half of the meta in one version and a really good deck that was great against half of the meta in the other version, and was like, well, if I just combine them, it'll be great against the entire meta. And it didn't work out that way. But so yeah, I was playing a Ruby Amethyst Jem Hawkins package with some speed to it. So I could get past the Buckies and draw off of, play the Queen's Castle for free and get some draw off of it to deal with the discard.
I mean, it's to kind of touch on something you said earlier. It is funny you mentioned that you're like, some people show up for fun, because I told my husband last night, I'm like, well, there's different kinds of players, some that aren't there to win. And he's like, who shows up not to win? And I was like, oh, I did. I didn't think that was going to happen, unfortunately. So yeah. And I think once you decide you want to win, then obviously then it becomes kind of binary. You're like, okay, well, I'm going to play what's going to win. But we
Yeah.
live in a post-digital client world where, getting reps in is hard.
It's really hard.
Yes. And so you can play online. I want to be that person. I even bought a little arm, but I'm just every day that I think about it, I'm like, oh, 2 cameras and people are going to see my hands.
I come from a large metropolitan area where they're very competitive. We had a TCG con in our area that was one of the first big Lorcana competitive tournaments. And then we've had several day 2s and promo card winners. So I get to weekly, there's at least 4 shops I can go and compete with people who are super competitive. So I do feel lucky in that it made me overconfident in my decision making though. So I think about the fact if I had not changed the deck, what might have happened, because it was people I had played against the days before.
And it's tricky. I mean, that's not a very good, smart academic sentence, but I think it's always hindsight. It seems like whatever you get paired against, that's the deck you didn't tailor your deck to. In the Magic the Gathering, people will talk about sideboard and how they're like, oh, I just wish we had a sideboard. And so people who haven't played that game, you get to take these extra cards with you. So then after your first round, you go, okay, well, our first match rather of the best of 3, you can say, well, let me put in these cards because I know this will be good against this. And we don't have that in Lorcana. However, we have 60 cards. So that's nice. But because of that, you always have to make a guess. I think there's always some amount of guessing, even if we're going to talk about net decking versus brewing. Even if you're net decking, you're still guessing what the best net deck would be at that tournament. Now, for the listeners, there might be a few people who are saying, well, I've heard meta. I know people talk about it. I think meta just means, what's the meta? I don't know. Like it's a Facebook company. But I want to be really explicit about what we are discussing when we say meta. So it's going to be the current state of competitive play. Like Brandon said, it's something that fluctuates locally and then it also fluctuates fast in time. The meta changes every weekend because ultimately, whenever there is a tournament result that comes out, you're going to have two types of people. You're going to have people to try to emulate the winners and people who try to target the winners. So I think because it is so over, it's something where, I mean, from week to week, technically day to day, the meta is going to change. It requires research. I think that's the fastest version is that you're going to have to research if you really want to know what the meta is at any given moment. So I wanted to kind of talk amongst us. I know you mentioned ink decks, Brandon. Are there any
Mhm.
other places that if you're like, listen, I kind of want to make my best guesstimate of where the meta's at right now, what are some resources that you would recommend to people trying to dig into it?
So I do really want to highlight Inkdex just for a second because it's the primary place that I go to, and I've found it's the most consolidated place to find regular, reliable results. So you can go to Inkdex. There's a little tournament tab. Click on tournament, and then you just get a list of like the most recent tournaments all across the world. You see how many players were in those tournaments. And I like to usually look at the ones that have around 40 or more players if I'm trying to get a real understanding of like what decks are popping up and doing better. And I literally just go through those tournaments, look at about the top 8 deck lists, see what ink combinations are, reappearing in those top 8s and how many of them are in the top 8s, and then individually looking at some of those lists. So Inkdex is the first place that I go look, specifically when I'm just trying to see what the meta looks like in different regions and roughly around the world. Um, there's not another place that I use that is that, like, consolidated. Dreamborn, I use a lot for deck building, and, also you can look at other people's deck lists, so there's a lot of content creators in Lorcana. A lot of the pro and competitive players in Disney Lorcana have deck lists on Dreamborn, and there's, like, I think you can go like look at decks and you can filter by popularity. And like usually if somebody's doing really well with a deck and they have it on Dreamborn publicly, you'll find the decks. A lot of people look at it. So you can see sort of what's trending on there as well. And then if you follow that, you can see when they make changes, like Sailor from Labyrinth. He does a lot of testing with Ruby Sapphire, and I haven't been playing the deck very much, but it's a deck that I'm interested in because I think it's a contender for one of the top decks in the format currently. And every couple days, I just go to Dreamborn. I have his deck favorited, and it'll show me when the last time was he updated it. And so every time there's a new update, I go in and I look at it and I see what changes he's made. So there's things like that. And then this is a much, much broader resource that I use, but like just YouTube and Twitter. And like there's so much content, especially competitive content around Disney Lorcana. And a lot of competitive players like to give their opinions on deck lists. And there's quite a few players that are sort of masters at a specific deck. And so if you find some of those competitive players and follow them, you can usually find some tips if there's a specific deck that you're looking for, or even if there's matchups that you want to learn a little bit more about, either how to beat or how to play those. Because I'll use Artabax as an example. Artabax is a European player who's been playing Emerald Amethyst for a very long time, and he regularly works on that deck. I don't play Emerald Amethyst. I don't really have a desire to play Emerald Amethyst, but I do want to know how to beat Emerald Amethyst. And so I can watch his videos, and he'll explain like what matchups are good, why they're good, and then which matchups are bad and why they're bad. And so you can do that with a plethora of different deck lists and players as well.
I think it's really good that you mentioned that it's about I mean, when I told my dad he was trying to learn Lorcana, I was like, well, first step, you learn how to play. Second step, you learn your deck. And then the third step is you learn every other deck out there. So the third step's the hard one.
Yeah.
But that I think is the big jump is because it's not about just what you're playing. It's about having like the foresight where if you see two cards, you're like, I have a 90% chance of knowing what this opponent's deck is.
Yeah.
Um, and I think YouTube is great because you can play and you can look at deck lists, but YouTube is kind of people are like boiling it down for you.
Hmm.
And I think the benefit of YouTube is you're either going to watch it and go, I agree, or you'll not agree. And either way, you're getting something out of it because you're either building your opinion either way, and kind of getting something out of that interaction when you watch content. Because I haven't found one person that's all the answers, but a lot of people have a lot of answers. And I think it's kind of, it's taking it and making this amalgam and being like, okay, this is my opinion on what's going to be good.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
always tell people if they can't play, then watch, because,
Yeah.
like, if I can't learn from playing, you can at least learn from watching for the reason you just said. Like, I watch what people are playing, I look at their hands. Sometimes I'll even pause the video, and I'll be like, what would I ink and what would I play this turn?" And then I figure that out for myself, unpause the video, and then see what they do. If they did the correct thing, then assuming this is a good player, I can go, "Okay, I had the right idea." And if they did something different, then I have to sit there and figure out, okay, like, was I wrong? What were they thinking? See if I can learn anything from that. So,
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, if you're playing against Ellie, there's a chance she built a deck that has 2 decks together, and you're like, "I don't know what's gonna happen." And that is a valid play style because I think I played
Yeah.
a steel ruby deck, a ruby steel, and every turn I was like, "I don't know what you're gonna do. Probably something terrible, something that I'm not gonna like." And it was every turn something I didn't like.
Yeah, we have an ongoing joke with me that if you hand me a deck and I've never seen it, I actually play better than it's one that I am comfortable with. And
Mm.
so Waylon thinks he's going to build a deck that I've never seen and hand it to me at a set championship and see if I can get past top 8 this time, because the last couple of weeks, except for when he didn't understand aggro and so tried to build an aggro deck that wasn't good. I say, build me a deck and hand it. And it has been working pretty well, just because
Mm.
my favorite meta source, report source, is no longer doing it. So
Oh,
it
no.
was Lorcana GG, and they were pretty good at getting things out. And so I would go there, and then actually suggest social media. Knive does a good job of compiling every list from every major tournament, not even major. He'll take it just from your 20-person set championship. And so you can really see what's out there and what's getting tops. And then taking that and kind of seeing what the scuttlebutt is about different things. Because as much as we like to think that if you have the secret sauce, it'll make you better, a lot of people tend to spill the secret sauce on social media if
oh
you
yeah.
watch close enough.
It's always a goat. That's the thing. It's always just a goat right at the end. That's the secret sauce to every
Yeah.
deck. Once we can splash in a color, then it's over.
Yeah. Well, now we
Uh,
have gathering knowledge. So gathering knowledge
oh,
is the new secret
Yes.
sauce.
it's my favorite card, and I'm so obsessed with making it work. I haven't done it yet, but it's
I'll
gonna
I'll send
happen.
you my hyper aggro that I'm at least top 8ing. I've had a top 7 this week with it. It's my most comfortable deck. And so
Yeah. And I think you mentioned something that I like with knives. He focuses on data, depending on where you are. Um, Is it fun to look at data? That depends. But for knives, it is. And we get to benefit from that. And I think that
Definitely.
is the benefit of a community like this is there are people who will do the dirty work of getting in there and making tables and stuff and analysis. I mean, best case scenario, if I'm going to go to league once a week and play my deck, I can get, like 6 rounds in. We have the power of the internet that just takes the power of the data and magnifies it. So suddenly you have more statistically significant data than you would if you're like, I played a few games and this is what was good. That's not fun to talk about, but it is the reality of when we talk about what's good or what's bad, the more reps you have in, that's probably gonna give you a better picture. But I will mention, you mentioned like things you like to play. And I think that's super important. And Brendan, you mentioned it too, that when you talk about comfort, you have to think about the length of the tournament and what you want to play. I played Steel Song and I like Steel Song, but Steel Song, I feel like is a decision tree after decision tree. And yeah, I mean, it's a great deck. I mean, I don't think it's ever left the contender as like a deck that can do well, but it can do well because you're making really hard choices over and over again versus there's other decks where it's pretty linear. You're going to follow it. You might not even care what the other person's doing. You might just be like, I have to run faster than you and good luck. While you steal song, I found myself getting tired. Are there decks that you have made a choice where you're like, listen, I might even be better at this deck and it might be better, but I simply cannot play this for a tournament. I won't do it.
I do the Emerald Amethyst Bounce Package deck. that was pretty high up in the meta for a little bit. And I built it out, played it, and because it was the hot deck. And after 3 weeks, I ceremonially trashed it. I did not actually trash the comments, but
Yeah,
I wanted to.
de-sleeved it. You
I
de-sleeved it with a candle.
Yes, de-sleeved it because it was just mentally exhausting and it made me feel like a terrible player. It was actually the deck that made me almost walk away from the game because I kept thinking, if I can't play this deck that is supposed to be built to just annihilate and I can't figure it out, do I belong in this competitive sphere?
Well, I'm glad you stayed because the answer is obviously yes. I think
Yeah.
there's no deck that's one size fits all. Because I mean, gosh, anytime I need sapphires in a deck, I'm like, I'm not touching it. I won't do it. Nobody needs that much ink. Okay, no one does. And if you do, think about it. Do you? So,
And now
yeah.
I play the bounce package, but don't bounce and throw people off.
No bouncing. It's the bounce, no bounce.
Yeah.
Sweeping the nation. Brandon, do you have any decks that you tried and it's hard because Steel Song I like. I have nothing negative and I go home to it. But like if it's a tournament more than 4 rounds, 5 rounds, I'm like, no, I will not be playing that for 9 hours today.
Yeah, so I think I have a sort of interesting experience with this sort of question because since set 1, Steel Song has been my favorite. It's the deck that I took to the Miami TCG Con, mainly because it had Stitch in it, honestly. That was like the first draw that I had to it. Unfortunately, Stitch isn't really in the deck anymore, but I really enjoyed the value that you could get out of the deck. There was a lot of people playing Amber Steel locally for me, so if you've ever played the mirror match, it's really not very fun. And so for that reason, I sort of stepped off of it. I've also pretty regularly, at least in Lorcana, found myself to enjoy decks that play a little bit more into the mid-range play style. So not quite aggro, not quite control, which fits the Steel Song thing. But for during into the Inklands, I really wanted to challenge myself to get better as a player, especially wanting to commentate a little bit more and needing to be informed sort of on how everything is played. So for the majority of Into the Inklands, I committed to Ruby Sapphire. I was like, I'm going to learn this deck. This deck makes me so uncomfortable because I'm like not doing anything for the first 3 turns, just letting my opponent get ahead and then sort of banking on the fact that I'll be able to catch up later. So I played that for almost the entire Into the Inklands meta. Then I'm sorry, not Into the Inklands. It was Ursula's Return. I was playing it for Ursula's Return. Then the set championships came up. I brought Ruby Sapphire to the first set championships that I went to and absolutely bombed out of the tournament. Like it was just all aggro all day. I learned there that I cannot expect my local meta to equal the global meta. And so immediately after that, I went back to my comfort pick, which was Ruby Amethyst instead of Steel Song, because Steel Song is very hard to play. And during Into the Inklands, all of the set championships that I played was Ruby Amethyst. And it was just because it was a comfortable deck. Like I knew how to play it. It was easy for me to play multiple rounds through that deck versus with a deck like Ruby Sapphire. I felt like every single turn I was making 100 decisions, and it is not a very easy deck to pilot, especially going into a blind room where you don't really know what everybody else is playing. And I performed a lot better with the Ruby Amethyst deck because it was just a comfort pick. I played it all of Into the Inklands. Not a ton of things changed for set 4. I think we got Queen. No, I don't remember when we got Queen's Castle, but there weren't very many changes to the deck. So it was relatively easy for me to continue on with there. And so, yeah, it's another reason why I tell people like just go with what's comfortable. You know, if there's a deck that and that's coming from somebody who played Ruby Sapphire the entire set. Like I should have been more comfortable with the deck, but it's just like it was sort of against what I was used to and against my play style. I was a lot more comfortable doing the Ruby Amethyst sort of mid-range slash aggro slash control, whatever it needs to be type of thing, depending on who you're playing against. So
Yeah, the lesson: don't leave your comfort zone. No,
Well,
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say you bring up a good point about comfort zone because it's going to be different for everyone. So Ruby Amethyst is your comfort zone, and I actually played that deck in order to push myself to learn how to play that deck. I'm very much I found the love of my life deck in Fast Vasa,
Mm,
Ruby, Amber. I was an Amber player from the beginning. My little Lilos and Stitches, and just turn
rest in
for
peace.
yeah, turn for lore as much as you can. And then kind of built out Still Song, not realizing it was Still Song because I was using pieces nobody else was. Uh,
Mm.
and I had the whole push myself too far and almost walked away. And someone handed me a fast bossa and was like, "Try this. I think you'll like it." And now it just feels like home. Like if I don't know, has shifted with the meta as it's come, and it's still a playable deck. And so if I'm having a week where I just feel like I want to be able to win and not have to think too hard, uh, I'll pick up my version of it and go. And it's interesting because some people think it's a deck that you do have to be specific in every single choice you make. And I'm like, no, there's a clear linear path forward for me, and it is never a second guess of a decision.
Yeah, and I think it's that comfort of knowing the lines of play. It's like chess. I think Lorcana is so similar to chess in the sense that
Definitely.
you could
Yeah.
take a snapshot and say, "What should you do next?" And people could probably come to a pretty common consensus on what would be the right move. There's spicy things, but there are lines of play that are more successful than others. Amethyst Ruby is like a comfort blanket. Oh my gosh, that deck. I never feel afraid, but I feel afraid with some decks. I think you mentioned like doing nothing for a few turns, and aggro has the opposite problem where you're like, if I don't win by turn 7, I need to scoop. Unfortunately, I have not reached where I need to go. So yeah, what do you like? I will say that we've talked about net decking and brewing a little bit. So I wanted to define that as well because I said it the other day on Twitter and they're like, what's net decking? I was like, it does sound cool. So we already referred to it. It's going to ink decks and you kind of look at the list and you pretty much emulate what you see versus brewing is a more creative approach. So you're going to build a deck based on your own personal preference. Illumineers Lindsay, she is really good at brewing. There's people who are just live for the brew. So the benefit of net decking, and we already mentioned this, is that you're leveraging data. Basically, you're taking the power of data, magnifying it by other people at other tournaments, playing it in other places, and you're basically using that. However, when you're brewing, you have that element of surprise. So a great example of that is going to be in Atlanta when Joshua Paltry won the tournament with an Amber Amethyst deck. And that's something where he got a little creative. There were cards where people were like,
A
what is
little.
that? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's why, Brandon, I have a question specifically for you because you got to know the power of surprise as both a player and a caster. So what kind of player would you recommend that anti-meta strategy to? And like, what are the benefits of putting in cards where people don't know exactly what to do with?
Yeah, so I think it's always extremely exciting to see rogue. Another term for this is like a rogue deck, right?
Mhm.
To make it in really far into a tournament because it's fun for everybody to figure out. And then, like you mentioned in Atlanta, Joshua surprised Liam and I playing his Amber Amethyst deck. But that being said, those decks take a lot of skill to get to that point. So Joshua, I imagine, played tons of games with that deck, testing with it, likely throughout the entire Into the Inklands set, if not even before then, before we even had Into the Inklands cards to make that deck work. And it's sort of because you really need a fundamental understanding of what decks are good in the format and then sort of like what those decks strengths and weaknesses are. So we talked about like some of the steps of becoming a Lorcana player, and like the first step is learning how to play, the second step is finding a deck that you like, learning that deck, and then that third one is learning what all the other decks do. And it's not as linear as that because I feel like as you're finding the deck you want to play, like you're trying a bunch of different decks, so you're kind of learning as you go along. But to brew a deck, especially a deck that isn't already sort of established as one of the top tier decks, um, you're likely giving up what you might hear as percentage points, which just means that when you take away the art and all of the pretty awesome stuff, which like brings a lot of people to this game, including myself, trading card games are really just like numbers and statistics.
Mhm.
And so, for instance, if we're walking into DLC Vegas tomorrow, I know that the majority of the floor is probably going to be Steel Song, Ruby Amethyst, and Ruby Sapphire, just because like those are the three decks that are making headway. And so every time I sit across from an opponent and I don't know what deck they're playing, I have to just sort of bet that they're playing one of those decks when it comes to my mulligan and deck strategy. So I say all of this to say, if you decide not to bring a, popular deck, even if it's not one of those big 3 and it's, let's say, like a tier 2 deck, I think it's really important to know how your deck beats the top level decks, because those are the decks you're gonna be playing the most, which is why it was really impressive, by the way, that Joshua did what he did, because Into the Inklands was an extremely diverse metagame. Like, I don't think there were probably 5 or 6 decks that anybody could have named off
Mhm.
as winning the tournament, and none of them were Amber Amethyst, by the way. Another point to this too is Joshua's deck was not teched very well for the steel matchup. And in, I believe, his entire 9 rounds, he never played steel. So if you're going to brew a deck and you're going to give up percentage points by not playing decks that are already strong, you're even kind of doing this anyway. I can get into this a little bit if you do pick a top tier deck anyway. You're also just sort of making bets that, like, okay, I'm just going to expect to not play into this color or not play into this ink. Another example about this, and then I promise I'll stop rambling, is in the same tournament, Zack Bivens brought an Amethyst Steel deck that was playing Jiminy Crickets, which was something that nobody had really seen either. Amethyst Steel was a um, popular enough deck that, like, I wasn't too surprised to see that, but it was a bit more focused towards an aggressive side with Pascal's and Jiminy Crickets. And he straight up told me, he's like, I built this deck because Steel Song was not very popular in the meta, and I was expecting to not see it. This deck does not do great into Steel Songs. Like, if I thought that I was going to be facing a lot of Steel Song, I wouldn't have built this deck and brought it. So, um, to be that person that brews a deck and brings it, especially to a large tournament, I think you have to have a really great understanding of what to expect, and then, like, also just how the rest of the decks function, so that you know in playtesting, like, whether your deck is actually going to be worth taking and can beat the decks that it needs to beat.
Yeah. I mean, it's so I love that you brought up Zach Biffins because I had the opportunity of running Intimate Texas and the glee he had when he's like, "Guess what I'm playing?" And I'm like, "I don't know." And he's like, "Lemon lime." And I'm like, "Whoa!" Because I mean, it's a maverick play to play something like that. Because I mean, and it's funny because he always gets very quiet on like Twitter and things, but it's
Oh
because
yeah.
it takes an immense amount of research. It's kind of like seeing through the matrix. You have to see everything and then like thread the needle to go through all that. But like you mentioned, there is that also luck component. I remember my first set championship, I was playing Steel Song and I saw one of my friends play Steel Song and they won. And I said, "Hey, Ruby Amethyst, or no, Ruby Sapphire kicks my butt. It's terrible. Like, how did you get through that matchup?" And he's like, "Never played it." And I said, "Great.
Yep.
That's excellent advice. I will do my best to not play them," which, as you know, you don't really get to pick that, unfortunately. But yeah, I will say that brewing is something I'm not quite at yet, but, Ellie, have you ever I mean, it sounds like Waylon is out in the kitchen stewing the brew.
So Waylon is definitely a brewer. He likes to get in here and put together decks, and he's constantly sending me thoughts and changes. And if anyone finds his dream board, it's Ice Bishop. You probably will see a ton of decks on it. I, on the other hand, I'm kind of a comfort zone player. So I came from Magic. I played that when I was a teenager. So I have about 20 years of experience in the TCG world. And I knew like what I like to play. And so when I came to Lorcana, I was like, oh, well, this is the style I like. And I'm jump ship because it's Disney and I love the art and I love Disney. And so I was like, where can I get as close to what I feel comfortable in Magic now? And so when I brew, I just look at the cards and think, okay, is this doing what I'm comfortable with? Or I might see one or two that's like, oh, this is a cool combo, and like try and build around it. But I'm very much a net decker that I'll take a list off of somebody else and then make changes here and there, which I think is the most important part. Uh,
Yeah.
Build out a deck that you find and you like the idea of, and then make it your own.
Yeah, and I would say that if I had to guess, if I was a betting person, I think most people fall in between the 2, because I think most people are gonna look and be like, "I don't know where to start," pick a deck and just play it and see what they like, and then start modifying and be like, "You know what? I need a Pascal in here. I cannot do nothing." So I would wager that a lot of people are doing some kind of combo. But I think sometimes people talk about net decking like it's like plagiarism or something. I think that is probably dangerous thinking because, there's only so many combos of cards and, you don't have to be creative. You can, but, that's at your own peril if you want to
Yeah.
get creative. So that would be my thing. I don't think net decking is plagiarism. Now, if you say
No.
like I invented this deck, then yeah, maybe that'd be weird. But then I do like when there's a deck where like I don't know what that was. There was like Alice, and then also so there's decks that elude description.
Or
But it's fun.
I brought up the fact earlier, like my Steel Song was using Tiana's from the day one that she was released. I was using Tiana and the Duke and favoring royalty in my deck. So we called it Royalty with Power because every character that hit the board had, or Royalty Resist, that was the name of it. Everything had resist and was royalty. So if the Duke was on the board, it got stronger and then it couldn't take damage. And I still had your pretty standard shifting for singing for the Steel Song package. But people would sit aside and see that Cindy drop into a song choice. But then they would see the Duke and be like, what? This is not Steel Song.
Yeah. That'll freak you out. Yeah,
yeah.
it's that second turn where they play something, you're like, oh no, and you're just.
Yeah.
I think there was a deck last time I talked about with Forbidden Mountain where it was like turn 1 Mulan, turn 2 Li Shang, and I'm like, this person's probably like sweating, like, what is this deck? And the answer is, I don't know, its own thing. Because then they had like an Alice and some other stuff where that'll throw your opponent off. Because there's so many times where I look at my hand and I'm kind of, any player will say that they're like, well, if they play this, I'll do this. But you don't get that when they start playing random stuff.
Or back then, Tiana had to be prepared. Won me a lot of games to be like, I'm so sorry, you can't play Be Prepared right now.
I know, but you have to make it resolve, right? I'm just kidding. That's too controversial. Not on this show. I will say that the big lesson for me, the kind of last discussion point I have here is that just because a deck is positioned well in the meta also doesn't mean that you can take it off the shelf and be like, I'm going to win. Because as you will see at like the DLC Fort Worth, almost 50% of the playing field was playing Emerald Steel Discard, and it didn't have an equal representation in the top cut. So I also so an example for me is that I know Ruby Sapphire, it's really good. It'll really punish you. But I know if I play it, not only will I be unhappy, but I'm probably not that good at it because I don't want to practice it. If you don't enjoy it and you don't know it very well, probably not going to win. The deck cannot drive you to the victory. So I know that you've mentioned that you try out decks. Between you two, I wanted to kind of see, do you think what matters more, the deck list or the player or a combination? I feel like I know the answer, but we can have an open discussion kind of.
It's definitely the combination. So you can make the most wild deck, and if it doesn't have a good curve or you have too many unequables, then you're not going to have a great day. If you mulligan twice into 7 unequables, then you're just not playing for a little bit. But at the same time, you can't pick just that standard Ruby Amethyst off the shelf and put no reps into it and think you're going to win first place at challenge. But I think the biggest takeaway actually I've learned from every competitive player I've talked to is that luck beats out skill. So no matter what you do, you can put all of the time into this. And I think Zack Biffin's kind of brought it up that he had days on the Lore Keeper that he had tournaments where he topped in Pokemon and then the very next week got last place. And so it is that kind of thing of recognizing that we can only do so much, that the cards are going to shuffle and what you get is what you get. And you can search and you can look and we can put in all the reps and know our through lines, and it could just not be our day.
Yeah, I think it's balance in all things. Because, you obviously can't just be like, hey, it's luck, dude. Who knows? Because, obviously every player that wins has skill. But just because you didn't win didn't mean you didn't have skill. You've watched a lot of matches. Probably more than any of us on this call. And you've talked to a lot of different players. What is your kind of thoughts on the balance between skill, luck, and the deck just being inherently a good deck?
Yeah, so I think there's it's sort of a funny idea to think that there is like a right deck. Like there's one deck that you could bring to a challenge and just like win the challenge with. Because I actually think there's like dozens of right decks that can win the challenge. And sort of alluding to what Elizabeth was saying, a lot of times it does just kind of come up to your matchups. I think if we had to like tier any of these things, player skill is probably the highest because like you have to be a good player to know what you're doing. Um, but we have examples of every type of person in deck like going into a DLC and winning. So we talked about Joshua bringing in a rogue deck that nobody saw, and like he was able to take Atlanta. He didn't see any steal. I mentioned that earlier in his early rounds, and so like that was very helpful in him getting through. And that was rogue deck. We also saw, I think it's I call him DKP, but it's Din Con Bam. I think I'm sorry
Mhm.
if I'm mispronouncing that. Like he's topped, I think, 3 DLCs now or something like that with Ruby Sapphire.
It's unstoppable.
And like he's done a little bit of innovating in that he's playing Dig a Little Deeper and like a couple cards in the Ruby Sapphire list that people weren't playing before, but for the most part it's a relatively stock list. And but he just like performs well. He just is a consistent player and comes in and does well. And we've Zack Bivens and Wonderland also like are both players that I think of who can regularly sort of show up to a challenge and at least make it into day 2 and to top. So I think it's a little bit of all of that, but I think the best players sort of are prepared to get lucky, if that makes any sense. Like
Yeah.
you that's like that's just how it is. You're gonna have some days where you show up and you play against all of your bad matchups, and like maybe that's why you didn't make it in. It's not necessarily that your 60 was incorrect. It was just like sort of wasn't your day. And I really like that mindset because I don't know about you guys, but when it comes to like playing Disney Lorcana, I can get really anxious about like my ability as a player and like how good of a player I actually
Yeah.
am. And if I go to a set champs and like bomb out of the set champs, I just suck at Lorcana, right? And it's like, well, not necessarily. Like, maybe you just brought the wrong deck, or like maybe it wasn't your day. You don't have to beat up on yourself on it. I think it's important to have that mindset and then also try to balance that with like taking player responsibility. Not to continue to talk about Zach Bivens, but he he has he I've always heard him say like regardless of the outcome, I always blame myself, which is sort of like there's something I probably could have done, which I think is a really great takeaway as a player if you want to get better as a player. And but being able to balance that with like it just wasn't my day. Like I got into the matchups that weren't very helpful for me. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, it's hard too because I mean, I would never tell, like, a new player, like, "It's on you," because then, like, they might mentally crush under that pressure. But, I mean, I think that's, like, the progression of, like, the pro player. I mean, we use pro in quotes because there's no true pro player, but, the players that for doing well is, they've kind of accepted all of those factors, that it is skill plus deck plus luck, and
Yeah.
that they can take all those things in stride without letting it be like, "Well, I'm not playing again." Another example is Kendall, and actually, no, I'm not played. I think it's a fascinating deck list because, set five's out and he's like, nope, my deck list is good. So he played a deck list that's not really necessarily any different than set four. And he played it like 3 different days and placed 2 of the 3 days. So, I mean, if it truly was the deck and the player and like it was just, nope, nothing else changes, then yeah, you'd think he's like, oh, he'd place the exact same every 3 times. But I mean, it's just there's going to be so much um being prepared for that luck, being prepared for unluck, and kind of keep moving forward no matter how it goes either way.
I, th-
Yeah, and I,
I
I think
think,
Brandon, you touched on it a little bit, but as a founding member of the Almost There Club, meaning I have top aided every set championship I have gone to and not walked away with a card. I have won multiple top eights in local tournaments, and prizing stopped at 6 or 7. And even in challenge, I got 29 points. So I didn't even max out points. I missed it by 1. I think it's important to remember Lorcana's still new. And if you come into a competitive environment, your ranking doesn't dictate your ability as a player. That it's so important to walk away from the day thinking, what did I do right? Instead of you have to remember what you do wrong. One of the things I will always regret is not inking a Sisu because I top decked the Be Prepared that would have gotten me the win against a Bucky deck. And I was on I was like number 58 at that point in Fort Worth. But that if I dwell on that one instead of all of the right plays I had made throughout the day, I would walk away and be like, I can't do this anymore. But realizing I did show up and do all 9 rounds
Yeah.
is an incredible feat and something to be proud of. So kind of balancing that as you go into competitive play. Like,
Yeah. And not to extend the episode by another hour, but I mean, I think that's why the best of two can be good, is because it does kind of highlight that there is value in all sorts of outcomes. I mean, obviously, 0 points is not fun, but when you draw, that is a sign that you are doing well. You're doing things right. And I say that I learned more in a Disney Lorcana challenge than I do during like a month of training. Like it's like drinking from a fire hose in those matches. So even in losing, you're going to get something out of it. So you might not win, but you won the knowledge. So I was proud of myself. So I think if I had to have a thesis statement and just like sum it up from my perspective, I would say if you're trying to figure out what deck should I bring if I want to win a challenge or a set championships, I would say it's a mixture of personal preference and knowledge, which is not a great answer. I really wish I could say, I mean, there's a couple decks. You could narrow it down. We can probably help a little bit there. But I think it really is just a mix of those two things and seeing it through from there. What about you two? Do you have any parting wisdom that if somebody came up to you and said, "Hey, I only have a minute, but I need you to tell me what I should do for set champs or a challenge?" Ellie, I'll start with you. What would you be your parting wisdom?
mine would be play the deck you're most comfortable with. You don't want to go into a long day, and that's the biggest part. These are long days. You don't want to go into a long day having to mentally beat yourself up to get through a deck. So something that you're super comfortable with that is competitive is always going to be your best choice. And don't forget to ink. That's what cost me.
Yeah.
That's what cost me a win. Was I chose to play a Sisu instead of ink it to 7 ink, playing a Ruby Amethyst deck, and my top deck the next turn was Be Prepared, and I couldn't play it.
You
And
weren't prepared for be prepared.
exactly. So don't forget to ink. Make sure you remember your curve and don't fall off of it.
Or play Sapphire, never stop inking. You're just always inking. Nobody can tell how many ink you need.
I tried that one time just to like learn that deck, and I played it for about a week and a half, and I looked over at Waylon, who that's one of the decks he plays, and I go, "How do you keep track? I don't remember if I've inked."
They're not. That's the secret.
And my turn has been 3 minutes long, and so much has happened that I don't
Who
even
knows
remember.
Who knows what they're doing? It's just magic tricks over there.
I tell you what,
Brandon,
there's no high greater than like being at 3 lore and then like looking at your opponent and being like, I think I have this game, and they look at you like you're crazy, and then you play like 6 items and like 2 dimes, and then you're like, all right, GG's.
yep. Just one tear falls down my cheek, and you're like, oh, wow.
I've actually, so Ruby Sapphire is a deck I try to practice with because I feel like it's like the most controlled deck in Lorcana. But I've gotten to the point where I stopped bringing it to local league because like nobody has fun playing against me because they'll do something for the first 5 turns and then just everything after that they play, I banish. And then I don't have fun playing it against them because every single turn I just say, I'm so sorry. And then I play something. Then I'm so sorry. I have to do this again. So yeah, I understand. But to get to the question that you actually asked, I would, if I had to sum it up, I would just say like play the deck that you've played the most. Like I think that's just another way to say play the deck that you are most comfortable with, and that doesn't even have to be the deck that you've played the most this set. If there's a deck that you played a lot and you enjoyed 1 or 2 sets ago, it probably looks a little bit different now, but generally it's going to be the same. There's going to be a lot of similar cards in those decks, and the play style probably hasn't changed very much. I think more than anything, like that's the important thing. There's definitely benefits and detriments to not choosing a top tier meta deck, especially if you're going to a much larger tournament like a DLC. But a lot of those percentage points sort of get made up. Like the ones that you lose for not playing the top decks, you gain because of your comfortability and playing a deck that like maybe other people aren't as familiar with. So, it all kind of evens out in the end.
Yeah. Yeah. And so to the listener that made it to this point, yeah, you could probably narrow it down. There's like 5 decks, but I think that with this knowledge, you're going to get closer to a winning deck. And now the top 8 get cards. So, everybody's getting closer to prizes anyway, just by the sheer change of how set championships are going to work, which is very exciting to get you away from the almost there club. Now you will be there.
Yes.
Hopefully.
And when you make
Well,
it, come back and share this episode so that everybody else can also learn
yeah,
this great knowledge and do the same thing.
Yeah.
yeah. The answer was research and practice. Very, but well, I want to thank you both for taking the time to chat with me on how you pick your own decks and your thoughts on the matter. It is an honor to get to talk to you both. Brandon and I have watched your career and been it's very exciting to listen to your insight on things. And I love your Twitch because that is something I could never do is play live. This is edited. I can't do live. That's horrifying. So that I'm very impressed by both of your work. So before we say goodbye, where can people find and follow you? I'll start with you, Ellie, and your Twitch channel.
Okay, so on Twitch, we're Sprinkle of Ink. We stream live on Wednesdays around 8 Central Time. And you can find us on all social media. We just launched on TikTok recently at sprinkle_of_ink. But we're also on X the most. So just chatting decks and chatting all things Lorcana. And find me at Challenge because I'm judging those now. So
Ooh, that's so exciting.
yeah.
Yeah, but the thing is you're going to find her. And this is a terrible analogy, but I do feel it is like seeing a really cute service dog because you want to be excited, but you're like, no, they're working and you can't get too excited, but you're excited. You're
And
excited to see them.
I'll be incognito because I was unfortunately told I can't wear my Lotso hat as a judge. I
That's
do.
unfortunate.
I wear it when I judge locally because it helps players find me because of the ears.
Pixar's coming to the game too. Like, come on.
It's just, it shows a bias towards Lotso people. Whoever is wearing Lotso shirts, they're like, well, they're going to play call in that favor. But, well, thank you. And Brandon, where can people find and follow your content?
Sure. Everybody can find me on YouTube, Instagram, X at B224. I don't make as many YouTube videos anymore. I will eventually when life slows down a little bit. But I do spend a lot of time on X. So if you care at all about any of my opinions, sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're not. You can check me out over there. And then when I travel to DLCs and stuff, I try to document some of the fun that I'm having there on Instagram as well. Also check out the Lorcana challenges. I've been lucky enough to get to cast a couple of them. Hopefully they continue to invite me back to cast them again. And if you do check those out and you enjoy or you don't enjoy what we're doing over there for the casting and the production, let us know so that we can do better. So
Yeah, it's a baby challenge, so we get to shape the future. But I will say, I love tuning in. It's such an exciting weekend when it's challenge weekend because I'm like, oh, I get to have something. I get to have like Lorcana in the background all day. So you've been a part of my weekends 4 times or 3 times now. So without even knowing, but a lot of other people too. There's a lot of people watching. So. Well, thank you again. And thank you to the listeners for joining me for another episode. As you know, there is always room at the inn. So if there's anything you want to hear me talk about, please feel free to email me at contact@thelorekeepersin.com or reach me at Twitter or Instagram at the socials linked in the description. As always, thank you for hanging out with me today. We are always happy to have you stop by the Lore Keepers Inn, no matter where your quest takes you. And remember, if you don't know where to find us, just take the second start of the right exit and head straight on till morning.